The wind howled through the steel canyons of Manhattan, carrying the bitter chill of an unforgiving winter night. The city pulsed with energy, horns blaring, neon lights flickering, people rushing from place to place, wrapped in designer coats, too preoccupied with their own lives to notice the lone figure hunched against the cold stone wall of a towering building. His clothes were tattered, barely more than rags, and his thick, unkempt beard obscured a face that had once been clean-shaven and full of promise. His name was Thomas Gallagher, a man who had once dreamed of building his own future, but had instead fallen through the cracks of a world that never looked back. Thomas had once been a man of dignity. He had worked as a construction foreman, overseeing projects that helped shape the very skyline towering above him. He had been strong once, confident, a provider. But life had a way of taking everything away piece by piece, until nothing was left but memories and regret. One accident, just one, had changed it all. A scaffold collapsed, sending him crashing down from the third floor of an unfinished building. His back had taken the worst of it, his ribs shattered, and his legs barely able to function the way they once did. The hospital bills drained his savings, and his recovery kept him from working. When he could finally stand on his feet again, the world had moved on without him. His job, gone. His apartment, evicted. His wife, unable to endure the stress. She had packed her bags and left. He didn't blame her. Who wanted to be stuck with a man who had nothing to offer anymore? Friends stopped answering his calls, and before he knew it, he had nowhere to turn. The first night on the streets had been the hardest. The shame of it clung to him like a second skin, burning worse than the winter wind. He still remembered sitting on a park bench, clutching his last $20 bill, debating whether to buy food or just spend it on cheap liquor to drown out the unbearable truth of his situation. Eventually, he had chosen food, but it had been the last time he had that luxury. Now, years later, he had become invisible. People walked past him every day, businessmen, tourists, socialites. Some would throw him a glance of pity, most wouldn't look at him at all. The occasional Good Samaritan would drop a few dollars into his trembling hands, and that was how he survived. That night was colder than most. The city's warmth felt farther away than ever, hidden behind closed doors and frosted windows where people laughed over hot meals, oblivious to those who had nothing. Thomas curled into himself, pulling his thin coat tighter around his shoulders, but it did little to protect him. His stomach growled, but he had long since grown used to the ache of hunger. Then, as he sat there, his head hanging low, a black limousine rolled to a slow stop just a few feet away. He barely noticed. He had seen expensive cars glide past 1,000,000 times before, their owners lost in their world of wealth and power. But this one was different. The car door swung open, and a pair of polished shoes stepped onto the pavement. The click of heels echoed against the concrete, and Thomas forced himself to look up. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He blinked, staring, unable to believe what he was seeing. Standing before him, silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights, was none other than Donald J. Trump. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Trump, the billionaire, the real estate mogul, the former president of the United States, the man who had been on magazine covers, television screens, and rally stages for decades. Trump stood tall in a long black overcoat, his golden hair unmistakable, his presence commanding as always. He surveyed Thomas with an unreadable expression, his blue eyes sharp and focused. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city bustled around them, but in that instant, it felt like everything had frozen. Thomas expected Trump to keep walking, maybe toss him a few bills and get back into his car. But then Trump did something completely unexpected. He stepped closer. Close enough that Thomas could see the faint lines of age on his face, the way his breath steamed in the winter air. "What's your name?" Trump asked, his voice deep and unmistakable. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't said his full name aloud in a long time. It felt foreign on his tongue. Thomas, he finally muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. Trump studied him for a moment before reaching into his coat pocket. Thomas braced himself, expecting a $100 bill, something generous, sure, but nothing beyond a simple act of charity. Instead, Trump extended his hand. Not with money, but with something far more shocking. "Come with me," he said. "Let's get you cleaned up," Thomas blinked. His mind scrambled to process the words. This had to be a joke, a stunt, a test. Why? He croaked. Trump's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." Thomas stared at him, his fingers numb against the cold pavement. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to reach out, to take the outstretched hand, to step into the warmth of that limousine and let himself hope again. But hope was a dangerous thing. He had learned that the hard way. His voice cracked as he spoke. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've lost." Trump tilted, his head slightly. "I know enough, and I know that life isn't about what you've lost. It's about what you can still gain." The words struck something deep inside Thomas, something buried beneath years of suffering and disappointment. He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. As he hesitated, Trump didn't move, didn't rush him. He simply stood there, waiting, offering something Thomas hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas slowly lifted his hand. His fingers shook as they met Trump's firm grip, the warmth of another human being cutting through the cold for the first time in years. And in that moment, Thomas Gallagher's life changed forever. Trump's grip was firm, steady, the kind of handshake that commanded attention. For a moment, Thomas hesitated, staring at the man before him, searching for any hint of deception. But there was none. Trump wasn't smirking, wasn't grandstanding. He was simply waiting, his expression unreadable yet oddly patient. Thomas exhaled shakily and, with the last bit of strength left in him, forced himself to his feet. His knees wobbled from the cold and hunger. But Trump didn't let go. One of the security guards stepped forward as if to assist, but Trump raised a hand, stopping him. "I got it," Trump said simply. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. It had been years since anyone had touched him without flinching. Years since someone had looked him in the eyes like he mattered. "Come on," Trump said, motioning toward the open limousine door. Thomas hesitated again. He had spent so long surviving on the streets, alone, fending for himself. Stepping into that car felt like stepping into another world, one he had lost a long time ago. Trump must have noticed his apprehension because he gave a small nod, his voice lowering slightly. "No tricks, no cameras. Just a warm place to sit and some food. You need it." The word food sent a painful jolt through Thomas's stomach. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a real meal. The memory of greasy dollar store, sandwiches and stale bread flashed through his mind. And suddenly the idea of stepping into that car didn't seem so crazy. Slowly he ducked his head and slid into the back seat. The warmth hit him instantly. The air was thick with the scent of fine leather, the faint trace of cologne, and something else, something comforting. The seats were softer than anything he had felt in years, and as he sank into them, he realized just how exhausted he truly was. Trump slid in beside him, closing the door with a soft click. The outside world, with all its noise and cold, disappeared. The car began to move. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas stared down at his own hands, at the dirt beneath his fingernails, at the way his tattered sleeves barely covered his wrists. He suddenly felt painfully out of place, like a stain on the perfection of the limousine's interior. A low voice cut through his thoughts. "You drink coffee?" Thomas glanced up. Trump was looking at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. Thomas swallowed. "Yeah, when I can." Trump knocked twice on the glass partition, and a moment later a voice came through a small speaker. "Yes, sir?" "Get my friend here a coffee, hot, strong, and something to eat." Steak. Thomas's eyes widened. Steak? He echoed, as if the word itself was foreign. Trump shrugged. You look like you need something real, not that garbage they give out at shelters. Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. Minutes later, the limo pulled into a high-end restaurant. One of Trump's men got out and returned with a steaming container. The smell hit Thomas first, rich, warm, buttery. His mouth watered before he even opened the box. Inside was a thick, perfectly cooked steak, accompanied by mashed potatoes and vegetables. It was the kind of meal Thomas had only dreamed of for years. His hands trembled as he picked up the plastic fork. He half expected someone to snatch it away, to tell him it was a mistake, that he didn't belong here. But Trump simply watched, nodding approvingly as Thomas took the first bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth. He chewed slowly, savoring every second, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He had forgotten what real food tasted like. Trump leaned back in his seat, watching him eat. After a few moments, he spoke again. You got a family? Thomas paused mid-bite. The question hit him harder than expected. He swallowed, his throat tightening. Not anymore, he murmured. Had a wife. She left. Trump didn't say anything. Right away. He just nodded, as if he understood. After a few moments, he spoke again. What happened? Thomas hesitated. He had never told anyone the full story. Most people didn't care. Most people didn't ask, but something about this moment, about sitting in this car, eating real food, about the fact that the man sitting across from him was someone he had only ever seen on television, made him answer. I was a construction foreman, he said quietly. Had a good job, good life. Then I fell, broke my back, couldn't work. Bills piled up. My wife... He exhaled sharply. She tried to stay, but it got too hard. We lost our apartment. She moved back with her. Family. I had nowhere to go. Trump listened without interrupting. I tried, Thomas continued, staring at the half-eaten steak. Tried to get back on my feet. No one would hire me. No address, no phone, no ID. Once you fall, people stop seeing you. You just disappear. Silence filled the car. Finally, Trump sighed and leaned forward slightly. You ever try again? Thomas frowned. Try what? To get back up. A bitter laugh escaped Thomas's lips. Every damn day. Trump studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Without a word, he placed it. On the seat between them, Thomas frowned. What's this? Trump crossed his arms. A fresh start. Thomas hesitated before picking it up. His hands shook as he opened the flap. Inside was a thick stack of $100 bills. More money than he had seen in years. His breath caught. In his throat. I can't take this, he stammered. Trump waved a hand dismissively. Not a handout. A loan. A chance. Thomas looked up, confused. A loan? Trump nodded. You use that to get a room, get cleaned up. Tomorrow morning, you're meeting someone. A guy I know runs a construction company. You want a job? It's yours. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had to be dreaming. A job? He whispered. Trump smirked. Yeah. You ever hear of those? Thomas let out a shaky laugh, his eyes burning with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Trump extended his hand once more. You in? Thomas looked at the money, then at the man in front of him. Then slowly he reached out and shook Trump's hand, and for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that his life was about to change. The limousine glided through the Manhattan streets, but Thomas barely noticed the world outside. His hand still trembled as he clutched the envelope of money. His mind swirled with thoughts too overwhelming to grasp all at once. A part of him wanted to believe this was real, but another part, the part that had been beaten down by years of hardship, kept whispering that this was too good to be true. Trump sat across from him, watching him closely, as if reading his thoughts. His expression was neither impatient nor overly sympathetic. It was assessing. "You don't trust it," Trump finally said. Thomas looked up sharply. He hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I don't know." Trump leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Look, I get it. You've been burned before. Life took a turn, and people turned their backs on you. You stopped expecting good things to happen because they never do. But let me tell you something." Thomas waited, his fingers gripping the envelope a little tighter. "Opportunities don't come around every day," Trump continued. "And when they do, you either grab them or you let them slip away. That money, that job, it's not charity, it's a ladder. I'm handing it to you, but you're the one who has to climb." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to believe in this. Wanted to believe that someone actually saw him, actually cared. But he had been disappointed so many times before. "What if I fail?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. Trump's expression didn't change. "Then you get back up. That's what winners do." The car slowed as it approached a hotel, a five-star establishment Thomas would never have dared to step foot in on his own. The driver pulled up to the front, and a doorman in a crisp suit immediately stepped forward. Trump glanced at Thomas and nodded toward the door. "First step, Gallagher, go in, get yourself cleaned up. You'll have a room for the next month paid in advance. You don't need to worry about anything except getting back on your feet." Thomas's breath hitched. A month? A place to sleep that wasn't a park bench or a shelter floor, a private shower, a warm bed. The very thought of it made his chest tighten. Trump reached into his coat pocket again and handed Thomas a business card. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Call the number. Tell them who you are, and they'll set you up with work. Construction foreman level. Not easy, but you know the job." Thomas took the card with shaking fingers. He read the name printed in clean, bold letters, Vanderbilt and Sons Construction. He had heard of them, a legitimate company, a real chance. He swallowed hard and looked up at Trump, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Trump tilted his head slightly, as if the question genuinely surprised him. "Because I can." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He had expected some long-winded speech, some explanation about politics or generosity or morality, but there was none. Just a simple, direct answer. Trump nodded toward the hotel. "Now go. And don't waste this." Thomas hesitated only a second longer before he opened the door and stepped out. The cold air hit him again, but this time it didn't feel as biting. He turned back just as the limousine's window rolled down. "One last thing," Trump said, his voice firm. Thomas leaned in slightly. "Yeah?" Trump smirked. "Get a haircut." Thomas blinked, then let out an unexpected, breathless laugh. It was the first time he had truly laughed in years. The limousine pulled away, disappearing into the night. Thomas stood there for a moment, staring down at the business card in one hand and the envelope in the other. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped through the hotel's doors, ready to take the first step toward reclaiming his life. Thomas stepped into the grand lobby of the hotel, his breath catching in his throat. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. The chandeliers overhead sparkled like something out of a dream. He had spent years walking past places like this, wondering what life was like inside. Now, for the first time in forever, he wasn't an outsider looking in. He was here. A well-dressed receptionist glanced up, her professional smile faltering. For only a fraction of a second as she took in his ragged clothes, the dirt on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes. But before she could say anything, a man in a tailored suit stepped forward from the side. "Mr. Gallagher?" Thomas flinched slightly at the sound of his name. It had been so long since anyone had addressed him with even a hint of respect. Yeah," he said, gripping the envelope and business card tightly. The man smiled, his demeanor friendly but efficient. Mr. Trump called ahead. "Your suite is ready." Thomas blinked. Suite? He had expected a small room, maybe something basic, with a bed and a bathroom. But a suite? His mind struggled to process it. "Right this way," the man said, gesturing toward the elevator. Thomas hesitated, looking down at himself. His coat was tattered, his shoes worn through. He looked like he didn't belong here. The man seemed to sense his hesitation. He leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. Mr. Trump insisted, "No questions asked." Something about that hit Thomas deep. No questions asked. Not out of pity, not as a spectacle. Just a simple act of help, with no strings attached except one. Don't waste it. Taking a deep breath, he nodded and followed the man into the elevator. Tawa. Suite was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. A large bed with crisp white linens, a sitting area with plush furniture, a private bathroom stocked with more towels than he had ever owned in his life. When he stepped inside, the warmth wrapped around him like a long-lost friend. He moved cautiously at first, as if afraid that any moment someone would realize there had been a mistake and throw him out. But no one came. This was real. This was his, for now at least. He caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked like a ghost. His hair was wild, his face gaunt, his beard thick and uneven. His clothes were little more than rags. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly see what he had become. Without thinking, he made his way to the bathroom. He turned on the shower and watched as steam filled the room. The sound of running water had never seemed so beautiful. Slowly, he stepped in. The moment the hot water hit his skin, a shudder ran through him. It was like the grime of the streets was melting. Away, not just from his body, but from his soul. He scrubbed until his skin felt raw, until the dirt circling the drain was gone, until he could feel like a human being again. When he stepped out, wrapping himself in one of the thick towels, he caught sight of something on the bathroom counter. A note. "Clothes are in the closet. Get some rest. Big day tomorrow." D.T. Thomas swallowed hard. He opened the closet and found fresh clothes, jeans, a button-down shirt, a warm jacket, and even a brand-new pair of boots. He ran his fingers over the fabric, still struggling to believe this was real. He dressed slowly, carefully, as if afraid that doing so would wake him from this dream. But when he looked in the mirror again, he didn't see the same broken man. He saw someone who could become whole again. For the first time in years, he slept in a real bed. And he slept deeply. Morning came too soon. A sharp knock at the door jolted him awake. For a second, panic flooded him. Was this it? Was someone here to tell him it had all been a mistake? He hesitated, then opened the door. A man in a work jacket and hard hat stood there, checking his watch. "You Gallagher?" Thomas nodded. "Good. Trump sent me. Car's waiting downstairs. Let's go. We got a long day ahead." Thomas blinked, his mind still shaking off the haze of sleep. Then, like a switch flipping, everything from the night before came, rushing back. The limousine, the steak, the money, the business card, the job. It wasn't a dream. It was real. He grabbed the business card from the nightstand, running his fingers over the embossed letters one last time before slipping it into his pocket. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out of the room, out of the hotel, and into the first day of his new life. Months passed. The job was tough, but Thomas worked harder than he ever had before. Every morning he woke up at dawn, put on his work boots, and poured himself into rebuilding not just the skyscrapers of the city, but himself. His body grew stronger, his hands rough with honest labor. With his first paycheck, he rented a small apartment. Not much, but his own. With the second, he bought a phone. With the third, he tracked down his wife. She had cried when she saw him. They weren't ready to fix everything, not yet. but for the first time, there was a chance. A real chance. One night, after another long shift, Thomas sat in his apartment and pulled out the envelope Trump had given him that first night. He hadn't touched the money since. He had wanted to earn everything on his own to prove to himself that he could. He reached for his phone. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Gallagher," Trump said. "I hear you're doing good work." Thomas exhaled, smiling to himself. Yeah, I am." There was a pause on the other end. Then Trump's voice came through, steady and sure. "Knew you would." Thomas glanced around his apartment, small but his. His hands were rough, his back ached from the day's work, but he had never felt stronger. He had climbed the ladder, and for the first time in a long time he was standing tall.